The pre-dawn hours held a particular quiet in the rectory, a stillness that usually offered a sacred space for lingering prayers or the peaceful descent into sleep. On this night, however, the silence was violently ruptured. The jarring, insistent shriek of the telephone pierced the velvety darkness of my small bedroom at precisely 3:17 a.m. I jolted awake, my heart immediately thrumming with a primal sense of alarm. Who could be calling at such an hour? A deathbed anointing? A family crisis? My eyes, still heavy with sleep, struggled to adjust to the faint glow of the digital clock on my bedside table, its stark red numbers mocking the peaceful rhythm of the night. I fumbled for the receiver, the plastic cool against my ear, and murmured a groggy, "Father Michael." The voice on the other end was Sergeant Murphy's, usually steady and laconic, but now laced with an undeniable tremor of urgency that instantly dispelled the last vestiges of sleep. The air in my room, normally temperate, suddenly felt frigid, raising goosebumps along my arms beneath my thin nightshirt. "Father," he began, his voice a tight rasp, as if he himself was struggling with the words, "You'd better get down to the church. The boy who desecrated your statue of the Virgin Mary is in our custody." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow, a cold, invisible fist to the sternum. Desecrated, statue of the Virgin Mary, custody. Each phrase resonated with an unsettling discord, forming a sentence so utterly contradictory, so profoundly out of harmony with everything I understood, that my mind struggled to even process it. It was an impossible sentence, a tangle of accusations and realities that simply refused to align. The image of our beloved statue, a plaster representation of Our Lady of Grace, her serene gaze usually a source of comfort, now flashed in my mind's eye, violated and defaced. My stomach churned, a knot of dread tightening with each beat of my bewildered heart. Sergeant Murphy continued, his voice heavy with what sounded like a mixture of professional duty and personal bewilderment, clarifying the identity of the accused. "It's Leo Miller, Father. We found him inside." Leo. The name echoed in the pre-dawn quiet, shattering the last fragments of my composure. 9-year-old Leo Miller, a boy I knew not as a vandal, but as one of the gentlest, most fragile souls in my entire parish. He was a quiet, watchful boy, often seeming to carry the weight of a world far too large for his slender shoulders. I pictured his wide, earnest eyes, his perpetually slightly hunched posture, as if always ready to retreat into himself. This was the boy they had in custody, not for some childish prank, but for an act of sacrilege against the very image he held most sacred. For weeks, for months even, Leo had been a fixture in the quiet alcove to the left of the altar, where our old venerated statue of Our Lady resided. I had seen him there countless times, sitting on the polished pew, utterly still, his gaze fixed upward at her painted face, a solitary figure in the vastness of the nave. He had claimed, with an earnest conviction that was both touching and, I admit, a little concerning, that the Blessed Mother spoke to him there. He wasn't like other children who might babble about angels or imaginary friends. Leo's pronouncements were always delivered with a solemnity that hinted at a deeper, more profound experience. I had always listened patiently, my pastoral heart torn between nurturing his nascent faith and gently guiding him back to what I considered more grounded expressions of spirituality. I had interpreted his words as the beautiful, unfiltered devotion of a child, perhaps a coping mechanism born from his challenging young life in the foster care system. Now, that innocent devotion was being twisted into something sinister, something criminal. "We found him with the can, Father," Murphy stated, his words cutting through my reeling thoughts. Royal blue spray paint, still clutched in his hands, trembling, like he was in shock. Royal blue. My mind immediately conjured the vibrant, deep hue often used to depict Our Lady's mantle in classical art, a color of celestial majesty and profound sorrow. The image was sickening, that pure, sacred color, meant for devotion, now allegedly weaponized by a child against the very object of his adoration. I imagined those small hands, usually so careful, so withdrawn, now stained with the harsh chemical pigment, trembling not just from fear, but perhaps from an overwhelming, inchoate grief. The tool of his alleged crime, a crude industrial can of paint, stood in stark, brutal contrast to the delicate spiritual whispers Leo claimed to hear. It was a desecration of the spirit as much as of the plaster. The contradiction hammered at me, sharper than any physical pain. It wasn't just illogical. It was an assault on my understanding of faith, of innocence, of the very nature of good and evil. The boy who believed he heard the gentle, loving voice of the Blessed Mother, the child who found solace and companionship in her serene presence, was now being accused of attempting to silence that voice, to mar that sacred image with an act of deliberate sacrilege. How could the same heart hold such devotion and such destructive intent? My priestly mind, trained to seek grace and redemption, wrestled with the grim reality. Was this a cry for help misinterpreted? Had the boy in his profound loneliness finally broken? Or was there some terrible, unfathomable truth hidden beneath this horrifying surface? A wave of profound sadness washed over me, heavy and suffocating. Not just for the statue, nor for the scandal this would undoubtedly ignite within the parish, but overwhelmingly for Leo. My heart ached for him. This fragile soul caught in the brutal jaws of circumstance and suspicion. I thought of the countless times I had seen him, a silent sentinel in the church, his face wrapped in what seemed to be genuine communion. Could I have been so wrong about him? Had I missed a darker undercurrent in his quiet intensity? Or was it the world that was wrong, quick to judge, unable to see beyond the surface? A silent prayer formed on my lips, raw and desperate. Lord, help us to understand. Guide us through this darkness and protect this child. The familiar comforting weight of my rosary beads, usually hanging by my bed, felt strangely absent. I reached for my trousers, my movements stiff and hurried, already anticipating the biting chill of the early morning air, both outside and within the hallowed, now defiled walls of my church. I had to go. I had to see for myself. I had to find Leo. The biting chill outside was a cruel mirror to the dread within me. As I fumbled with my keys in the pre-dawn darkness, the cold metal a shock against my fingers. The air, usually crisp and invigorating at this hour, felt heavy with unspoken accusation, a palpable weight pressing down on my chest. Each turn of the wheel brought me closer to the church, to the truth, or perhaps to a deeper tangle of questions. The sergeant's words kept replaying, a broken record in my mind. The boy who desecrated your statue of the Virgin Mary is in our custody. And then, the name. Leo Miller. It was a wound, not just to the statue, not just to my parish, but to my very understanding of the sacred and the innocent. I had to go. I had to see for myself. I had to find Leo. But as my old sedan rumbled through the quiet streets, the streetlights casting long skeletal shadows of winter-bare trees, a different kind of urgency settled over me, one that pulled me away from the immediate scandal and towards something deeper, something foundational. To truly grapple with what the sergeant had alleged, to even begin to piece together the shattered fragments of this night, one had to first understand Leo. And to understand Leo, you must first understand the silence he came from. Mark and Sarah Miller were a testament to quiet perseverance, their lives a gentle prayer for a child. I had known them for years, a kind and earnest couple, diligent in their faith, active in parish life, yet shadowed by a persistent ache. Their dream of parenthood, a longing etched onto Sarah's gentle face and visible in Mark's often distracted gaze, had been denied them biologically. Years of silent suffering, of quiet hope turning to quiet despair, had led them down the path of adoption. They were good people, deeply so, whose hearts were open, yet understandably anxious. The yearning for the family they couldn't have on their own had become the defining narrative of their adult lives, shaping their anxieties as much as their love. Leo, when he finally arrived in their lives a year prior, was not the eager, outgoing child of their dreams, a child whose laughter would instantly fill the empty spaces in their home. He was an island, yes, but not one of peace, rather an island shaped by the relentless tides of absence, by 5 years adrift in a system designed for care but often delivering only constant flux. 5 years of foster care meant 5 years of temporary homes, of new faces, of learning to adapt and then letting go. 5 years of packing and unpacking a meager collection of belongings. 5 years of being an observer, rarely a participant, in other people's lives. What does that do to a child's spirit? It teaches a profound caution, a deep-seated watchfulness, a vigilance born of needing to anticipate the next upheaval. He arrived with a small, worn backpack and an even smaller voice. He was 9 years old, a wisp of a boy with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of quiet observation, eyes that darted and absorbed, yet rarely met another's directly. He was watchful and distant, perpetually on the periphery, as if poised for an immediate, unannounced departure. Mark and Sarah showered him with affection, with toys, with the stability he had never known. But the silence persisted, a thick, invisible wall around him. When he did speak, his words were tiny, carefully chosen pebbles dropped into a vast, echoing well. They seemed to float for a moment, suspended in the air, before sinking, as if he expected them to be snatched away, or perhaps simply disappear, unheard. There was a hushed, careful tone to his utterances, a hesitancy that spoke volumes about a world that had perhaps punished him for speaking his mind, or more likely simply failed to listen. He rarely initiated conversation, and when questioned, his answers were laconic, delivered with a slow deliberation, as if each syllable carried immense weight. This was not the shyness of a child unaccustomed to social interaction. It was the practiced reserve of a survivor, one who had learned that silence was a safer dwelling than speech. It was a silence that, while heartbreaking, also held a peculiar dignity, a profound inner life that few were invited to witness. It was in the church, however, that Leo's silence took on a different quality. Our Lady of Grace Church, with its soaring arches and the gentle murmur of history echoing in its stones, was to many a sanctuary. But to Leo it was a particular corner of it that truly resonated. A quiet alcove tucked away near the sacristy entrance, bathed in the soft, filtered light of a small stained glass window, depicting the Annunciation. This was the domain of our old plaster statue of Our Lady of Grace. She stood perhaps 5 feet tall, her face serene and ageless, painted with delicate brushstrokes that suggested a knowing kindness. Her head was gently bowed, her eyes cast downwards in an attitude of gentle contemplation, and her hands were open, palms upward, in a gesture of acceptance and offering. Her mantle, painted a deep celestial blue, draped gracefully, and a simple golden halo encircled her head. She was not a grand, imposing figure, but rather one of quiet grace and unwavering presence. She was a silent observer, a perpetual witness, and in her stillness, Leo found a mirror to his own quietude, yet also a profound contrast. Her stillness was one of peace, his often of guardedness. I would often see him there, sometimes after Mass, sometimes when I was preparing for a quiet hour of adoration. He would be on the worn kneeler directly before her, a small, unmoving figure, his gaze fixed on her face. His posture was never fidgety, never restless, as one might expect from a boy of 9. It was a posture of profound listening, of patient waiting, of seeking. Other children might race around the nave, their whispers echoing, their curiosity drawing them to the vibrant colors of the altar or the solemnity of the crucifix. But Leo was always drawn back to her, to the quiet alcove, as if tethered by an invisible yet unbreakable thread. I remember thinking initially that it was a simple, innocent fascination, the kind children often develop for a particular saint or sacred image. I smiled at him, offered a gentle blessing, perhaps a word or two about Our Lady's love. But over the weeks and months, I began to see something more profound unfolding. His visits became longer, more frequent. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a communion that transcended mere looking. For Leo, the silence wasn't a void to be filled with noise. It was a canvas, a space where he could finally hear, where perhaps he felt truly seen for the first time. In the unblinking, compassionate eyes of the statue, perhaps he found a constancy, a non-judgmental presence that had been sorely missing from his young, tumultuous life. He didn't need to speak. She didn't demand it. Their interaction was a language of the heart, unspoken, yet deeply felt. The Millers, while pleased that Leo found comfort in the church, had, I believe, interpreted his silent devotion as a simple coping mechanism, a quiet retreat from the stresses of adaptation. They saw it as positive, certainly, but perhaps without grasping the depth of his connection, the intimate nature of the bond he was forming. They hoped it would help him normalize, to eventually shed his shell. They yearned for him to engage, to speak, to be like other boys. But for Leo, the quiet alcove and the serene gaze of Our Lady were not a means to an end. They were, I now realize, an end in themselves, a source of unparalleled solace and, as it would turn out, something far more extraordinary. And so, to hear the sergeant's words, that this boy, Leo, the silent guardian of Our Lady's alcove, who found his only real solace in her unchanging presence, had defaced her with spray paint, twisted the very foundations of my understanding. It was not merely an act of vandalism. It was, if true, a profound betrayal, not just of the parish, but of something sacred and intensely personal to Leo himself. It was utterly illogical, a contradiction so stark it defied reason. It was as if the sun had suddenly decided to rise in the west. As a priest, I am called to see Christ in everyone, but sometimes the veils of human behavior are so thick, so woven with pain and misunderstanding, that it requires a deeper grace to truly perceive the divine spark. I had watched Leo. I had prayed for him. I had tried to offer him comfort and guidance, but had I truly seen him? Had I understood the silent language of his heart? Or had I, like so many others, simply imposed my adult assumptions onto his profound quietude? Could it be that what we, in our adult wisdom, dismissed as childish fantasy, was in fact a pure, unadulterated channel to the divine? The cold dread of the early morning hours, the shame of the defiled statue, these were immediate wounds. But the deeper ache was for Leo, for the silent, watchful boy who had found his voice in the quiet gaze of Our Lady. I knew then, as my car finally pulled into the church parking lot, the dim outline of the familiar building a stark silhouette against the lightening sky, that the true path to understanding lay not in the harsh light of accusation, but in the tender, patient unfolding of his story, and perhaps in the silence where even God chooses to speak. I had to find him. I had to listen. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the empty church sacristy, usually a quiet comfort after evening mass, felt like a judgment that night. My thoughts spun, a labyrinth of self-reproach and urgent concern for Leo. I had to find him. I had to listen. That resolve, forged in the liminal space between pre-dawn dread and the stark reality of the defiled statue, echoed now in the quiet of my memory, a ghost of what I should have done. It led me back inevitably to the very first whisper, the moment I, in my well-meaning but tragically flawed wisdom, had begun to build the wall instead of dismantling it. It was a Tuesday, I recall, a day like countless others in the rhythm of parish life. The evening mass had just concluded, and the last few parishioners were drifting out, their murmurs fading into the cool autumn air. The lingering scent of frankincense and beeswax still clung to the sanctuary, a sacred perfume that always settled my spirit. I was gathering the communion vessels, my mind already on the evening's sermon notes, a familiar comfort in the predictable routines of my vocation. Leo, as was his custom, was the last to leave. He wasn't usually in the sacristy. He preferred the quiet alcove where Our Lady of Grace stood, bathed in the soft glow of a perpetually lit votive candle. I hadn't noticed him approach. He was a creature of such profound stillness that he often moved through the world like a shadow, easily overlooked, especially by an old priest absorbed in his duties. But then, a gentle tug, not rough, but persistent, on the heavy fabric of my cassock. I turned, my mind still half lost in theological exposition, and found myself looking down at him. He stood very close, his small hand still clutching the wool. His eyes, usually wide and watchful, held a new, almost urgent intensity. They were the color of deep river stones, pools of unplumbed depths, and in that moment, they seemed to plead with me. "Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of the building. A fragile sound that seemed to carry the weight of something immense. "She says, her heart is sad for us." The words hung in the air between us, crystalline and unexpected. My first instinct, born of years of pastoral care and a well-honed understanding of children's vivid imaginations, was a gentle one. I knelt as I always did, bringing myself to his eye level, a gesture meant to convey respect and genuine attention. The worn wood of the sacristy floor pressed against my knees. I placed my hand, broad and calloused, on his thin shoulder, feeling the fragile bone beneath my palm. His small frame seemed to vibrate with an unspoken message, a child's sincerity that was both disarming and, to my trained mind, easily explained. "Leo, my boy," I began, my voice soft, meant to be reassuring. "That is a beautiful thought. Our Blessed Mother. She loves us all so very much, doesn't she? And when we are sad, or when the world is sad, her heart aches for us, just like any good mother's would. Sometimes when we sit quietly and pray to her, we can almost feel her love speaking to our hearts, can't we? It's a wonderful comfort, a way she lets us know she's with us." I remember the slight tilt of his head, his eyes still fixed on mine, searching. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. There was no flicker of the typical childish delight at having one's imaginative play acknowledged and gently affirmed. Instead, a subtle shudder seemed to fall behind those riverstone eyes, a fleeting shadow of disappointment, perhaps even a hint of something deeper, a quiet sorrow, mirroring, I now realize, the very sadness he attributed to Our Lady. He simply withdrew his hand from my cassock, turned, and walked silently out of the sacristy, a small solitary figure fading into the dim nave. I stood up, a faint ache in my knees, and watched him go. A sweet child, I thought, a sensitive soul finding solace in faith, as so many children do. It was a beautiful expression of his budding spirituality, a testament to the power of imagination blended with devotion. I felt a gentle warmth in my chest, pleased that he felt such a connection, yet entirely unperturbed by the literal interpretation of his words. As a priest, I had encountered countless instances of children, and even adults, feeling a profound spiritual presence, interpreting it in ways that reflected their innocence or their longing. It was part of the richness of faith, I believed then, this ability to perceive the divine in deeply personal, often metaphorical terms. Later that week, I made a point to call Mark and Sarah Miller. I wanted to share what I saw as a lovely, if slightly precocious, moment of spiritual insight from Leo. I thought it would bring them comfort, perhaps even a chuckle. I chose a quiet evening, believing they would appreciate the update on their son's integration into parish life. "Mark, Sarah," I began, after the usual pleasantries. "I wanted to share something charming that Leo said to me after Mass on Tuesday. He came up to me and told me Our Lady's heart was sad for us. Isn't that a lovely way for him to express empathy and connection to the Blessed Mother?" There was a silence on the other end of the line, not the comfortable pause I'd expected, but a taut, strained quietude that prickled the air. Then, Sarah's voice, tight with an anxiety I hadn't anticipated. "Father Michael, with all due respect, "We're concerned," she said, her words carefully measured, yet edged with a barely suppressed tremor. "He's been saying things like this more often. Not just about the statue, but about hearing voices generally. We've tried to gently dissuade him, to explain that it's just his imagination, but he insists." Mark then interjected, his voice deeper but equally laced with worry. "We've seen it before, Father. In the foster homes, the other children, the social workers. Sometimes children who've been through what Leo has, they can retreat into fantasy. It's a coping mechanism, we understand that, but we just want him to be, well, to be normal." The word hung between us, heavy and burdened. Normal. Their dream, their fervent prayer for a family, now seemed threatened by this perceived deviation from the norm. They loved Leo. Truly they did. I had no doubt of their deep affection and their earnest desire to provide him with a stable, loving home. But their love, in that moment, was colored by fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of judgment, and perhaps most acutely, fear that Leo's fragile psyche was manifesting symptoms of a deeper, more troubling instability. I tried to reassure them, to bridge the gap between their anxieties and my own, admittedly superficial interpretation. "I understand your concerns truly, but from where I stand it seems like a very tender expression of faith. Perhaps he's just a deeply sensitive child, more attuned to spiritual nuances than others." "Sensitive, yes, Father," Sarah replied, her voice growing firmer. "But there's a line, isn't there? We've already had a few, incidents at school." He told his teacher that his deceased birth mother was speaking to him through the classroom gerbil. "We want to believe him. We truly do. But we can't afford to ignore these signs. We don't want him to be misunderstood, or worse, labeled." The mention of his birth mother, of a gerbil, certainly added a new dimension, one that made my beautiful expression of faith feel a little less robust. It shifted the context dramatically. My initial gentle dismissal now seemed, in their eyes, to be complicity in a dangerous delusion. They weren't talking about the metaphorical voice of Our Lady's love. They were talking about a pattern of what they perceived as hallucinatory behavior. "We've made an appointment with a child psychologist next week," Mark continued, his voice heavy with a decision already made, a step taken out of love and desperation. "We believe it's for the best, to help him process his trauma, to find healthier ways to cope." I listened, my pastoral heart torn. On one hand, their reasoning was sound, understandable. Children who had endured the trauma of the foster care system often carried deep wounds, and professional help was frequently invaluable. As a priest, I had always advocated for a holistic approach to well-being, acknowledging the interconnectedness of body, mind, and spirit. It wasn't my place to gainsay a parent's decision to seek care for their child's mental health. But even as I affirmed their decision, a small, insistent voice within me, a subtle spiritual intuition, whispered of a different possibility. What if? What if Leo was not merely retreating into fantasy, but was, in his innocent, unburdened way, truly perceiving something beyond the veil of our common reality? What if, in our attempts to normalize him, to fit him into the neat boxes of therapeutic models and societal expectations, we were inadvertently silencing a genuine spiritual gift? That night, as I reflected on the conversation, I could feel the invisible threads beginning to fray. The Millers, in their loving but anxious efforts to protect Leo, were inadvertently pushing him away. They saw his claims as symptoms to be treated, not as messages to be heard. And I, in my well-intentioned but ultimately superficial understanding, had contributed to that dismissal. The more they pressed him towards therapy, the more Leo retreated. He became even quieter, if that were possible. The few times I saw him in the church after that, he would still sit in Our Lady's alcove, his small form utterly still, his gaze fixed on her serene face. But now, when our eyes met, there was a new reserve in his. The searching urgency that had marked his first whisper was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a subtle tightening around his mouth. It was the look of a child who had attempted to share a profound truth, and had been met with polite disbelief, then growing concern, and finally the earnest but uncomprehending insistence of those who loved him. He began to view himself, I believe, not as a child with an overactive imagination, but as the sole keeper of a heavenly secret. The adults in his life, including his adoptive parents, and I regret to admit myself, had inadvertently drawn a line in the sand. On one side stood the conventional world, the world of trauma and therapy, of rational explanations and unspoken fears. On the other side stood Leo, alone in his direct, unfiltered communion with the divine. A secret he now understood must be guarded, for no one seemed ready to believe him. The chasm between his inner world and the outer one, between his perception and ours, began to widen, growing deeper and more isolating with each passing day. And in that widening chasm, a quiet, desperate faith was taking root, unheard and dangerously misunderstood. The chasm, as I called it then, widened not with a sudden crack, but with the slow, inexorable pull of two worlds drifting apart. I watched it happen, an unwitting participant in its formation, standing on the precipice of what I understood and what I could not, my heart aching for the small, solitary figure caught in the middle. It is a peculiar burden, I have found, to minister to souls when the divine reveals itself in ways that defy all earthly logic, especially when those revelations fall upon the tender, untainted heart of a child. We adults, so quick to categorize, to diagnose, to rationalize away the miraculous, often forget that the kingdom of God belongs to such as these, to those who approach the sacred with an open, unburdened mind, free from the cynicism and weary skepticism that age so often bestows. I recall an afternoon, perhaps a week or two after Leo first whispered of Our Lady's sadness. He had begun to visit the church with an almost ritualistic regularity, not just for Mass, but in the quiet hours of the day when the sanctuary was mostly empty. He would sit on the worn wooden pew, always the same one, directly facing the alcove of Our Lady of Grace, his small body a picture of profound stillness. He seemed to draw strength from her serene gaze, a silent dialogue unfolding between the plaster statue and the lonely boy. I would often find him there, sometimes just before locking up for the night, his face illuminated by the dim, ambient light filtering through the stained glass of the Assumption window. I made it a point to pass by, to offer a quiet blessing, a gentle word, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. I saw it then as a refuge for a troubled child, a healthy coping mechanism, perhaps even a nascent spirituality forming. I did not yet grasp the full, startling truth of his experience, nor the weight of the secret he carried, growing heavier with each passing day. One blustery Tuesday, the kind of day when the autumn leaves swirled like confused thoughts across the cobblestones outside, I was preparing for an evening Bible study. The church was hushed, save for the whisper of the wind against the ancient windows. I saw Leo in his usual spot, and this time there was an unusual intensity to his stillness. His small hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the statue with an almost fierce concentration. As I approached, he turned, and for the first time, his eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of urgency that made me pause. "Father Michael," he began, his voice a little stronger than usual, though still soft, carrying a conviction that pricked at my cautious understanding. She gave me a message." I knelt beside him, my heart stirring with a mix of warmth and a familiar apprehension. Was this another expression of his vivid imagination? Another tender reach for connection? Or was it something else entirely? Did she, Leo? And what did Our Lady say today? I tried to keep my tone even, gentle, open, yet subtly guiding, careful not to encourage what I still believed to be fantasy, but equally careful not to shut him down entirely, not to extinguish the fragile flame of his faith. He leaned in, as if to impart the most profound secret, one meant only for my ears, though he insisted it was for all. His breath was warm on my ear, carrying the faint, sweet scent of the communion wafers we'd shared just days before, a memory of grace. She said, "Tell them to remember my son is still here, even when they cannot see him. She wants everyone to know, Father, for the whole parish." The words hung in the quiet air between us, simple, yet echoing with a power that transcended their childlike delivery. "Tell them to remember my son is still here, even when they cannot see him." It was a message of profound theological depth, a beautiful encapsulation of faith in the unseen, of Christ's enduring presence in the Eucharist, in His church, in our very lives, even when doubt clouds our vision or suffering obscures His light. It was a message that resonated deeply within my own priestly heart, a truth I had dedicated my life to proclaiming from the pulpit, and that, I admit, was precisely what made it so troubling. For a 9-year-old boy, whose life had been marked by absence and uncertainty, to articulate such a mature spiritual insight, not as his own thought, but as a direct communication from the Blessed Mother, it was disquieting. My first thought, perhaps born of a lifetime spent seeking natural explanations before supernatural ones, was of coincidence, of something he might have overheard, a sermon perhaps, or a phrase from a prayer he'd absorbed. But his conviction, the earnestness in his wide, innocent eyes, the way he spoke the words as if relaying an unassailable truth, was unnerving. I sat back on the pew, my brow furrowed in thought, my gaze drifting from Leo to the serene face of the statue. That's a very beautiful message, Leo," I said slowly, weighing each word, feeling the immense responsibility of my position. "A very important one. Our Lady always wants us to remember Jesus, to feel His presence with us, even when it's hard." He nodded, a small triumphant smile gracing his lips, his small face alight with the joy of a mission received. "She said it's for everyone, For the whole parish, Father. Not just for me. This insistence on it being a public message, not just a personal comfort, solidified my concern. It moved beyond the realm of private, imaginative consolation into something that demanded public acknowledgement, or, in my hesitant mind at the time, public management. I knew I had to speak to Mark and Sarah again, to try and navigate this delicate, bewildering situation, hoping against hope that I might find some common ground, some way to understand what was happening, even if I couldn't yet believe it. The meeting with the Millers took place in my small, somewhat cluttered office, just after dinner the following evening. The air was thick with the scent of old books and brewing coffee, a stark contrast to the fresh, almost ethereal scent of the church's alcove where Leo found his solace. Mark sat stiffly in the armchair, his hands clasped between his knees, his face etched with a familiar tension that had only deepened in recent weeks. Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands, her eyes already brimming with unshed tears, her entire posture conveying a fragile exhaustion. They were good people, loving people, but they were also, I realized, utterly overwhelmed, teetering on the brink of despair. The dream of a family, once so vibrant, was slowly being consumed by a growing nightmare. "Father," Sarah began, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "It's getting worse. He's completely fixated. He says Our Lady is telling him things now, things for the whole parish. He says we all need to remember Jesus is here even if we can't see him. He keeps saying it, over and over." I recounted Leo's message, choosing my words carefully, trying to convey the beauty of the sentiment without lending credence to its alleged origin. He told me Our Lady wants everyone to remember that her son is still here, even when they cannot see him. It's a very profound idea, a central tenet of our faith. A visible shiver ran through Sarah, but it was not one of spiritual awe. It was one of cold fear. Mark sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of all their anxieties. "You see, Father? It's not just imaginary friends anymore. This is delusion. He's truly believing this, and he's trying to convince us. He's trying to convince you." There was an edge of desperation in his voice, a plea for me to validate their rational, earthly concerns. "We just want him to be a normal boy, Father," Sarah pleaded, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "To have friends, to play, to just be a child, to experience a childhood free of this obsession. But he's always in his own world, and now this. People are starting to notice. They're asking questions. We hear the whispers." The Millers' dream, their yearning for a family, had been so earnest, so poignant. They had envisioned a life filled with laughter, with the ordinary milestones of childhood, with the quiet comfort of a loving home that would heal the wounds of Leo's past. Instead, they found themselves navigating a labyrinth of concern, whispers, and now, the terrifying prospect of psychiatric evaluations. Their fear was palpable, a raw, exposed nerve. They saw Leo's claims not as a possible conduit to the divine, but as a symptom, a tragic manifestation of trauma from his past, a dangerous mental instability that threatened to unravel the fragile normalcy they so desperately sought to build. They were not equipped for this, for a child who saw the world through such a different, perhaps sacred, lens. I tried to bridge the chasm, to offer a comforting, yet ultimately unhelpful explanation. "It's a beautiful message, Sarah, Mark. Perhaps Leo's way of processing his own faith, his own feelings of being unseen. Children sometimes express deep spiritual truths in very literal ways, drawing comfort from the saints." I knew even as I spoke that my words sounded hollow, a dismissal dressed in pastoral concern. I was trying to soothe, to explain away, to make the extraordinary fit into the ordinary boxes of human understanding. And in doing so, I was inadvertently reinforcing their fear, confirming their suspicion that this was indeed a problem to be solved, not a mystery to be explored, not a truth to be embraced. "But he says she speaks to him, Father," Mark insisted, his voice tight with frustration, his hands clenching and unclenching. Out loud, he insists she's real, that her face moves, that her eyes look at him. This isn't just imagination anymore. This is serious. We've been reading things online about children who exhibit these kinds of behaviors. It's a sign of deeper issues, Father. Trauma can manifest in very strange ways, and we need to help him before it's too late, before he truly loses touch. The specter of deeper issues, of trauma and its terrifying implications, loomed large in their minds, eclipsing any possibility of divine intervention. Their love for Leo was undeniable, fierce even, but it was a love suffocated by anxiety, by the societal pressure to conform, to present a normal child. They feared the judgment of doctors, of social workers, of a world that often pathologizes anything that strays from the statistical mean. Their pleas for him to stop talking about Our Lady began subtly, gently, in the quiet evenings at home. "Leo, darling, We understand you love Our Lady, but maybe we don't need to tell everyone she talks to you. It might worry people, and we don't want people to worry about you." But as Leo's conviction deepened, as he continued to relay Our Lady's message with unwavering certainty, so did their desperation. The pleas morphed into demands, laced with an unspoken desperation that bordered on panic. "Leo, you simply must stop saying these things. It's not healthy, it's not right, it's making people upset." And then, as their own reputation within the community began to fray under the strain, as the whispers grew louder, the demands curdled into threats. "If you tell one more person that statue talks to you, Leo, we're going to have to get you some real help. Do you understand? The kind of help that means you might not be able to come to church as often. The kind of help that will take you away from home." Each escalation, each layer of parental concern hardening into an ultimatum, pushed Leo further into himself. The boy who already struggled to find his voice now found that his most profound truths were met with fear and rejection. He retreated, not from his belief, but from those who refused to share it, those who sought to silence it. The chasm grew, becoming a canyon, vast and lonely, separating him from the very people who had vowed to cherish him. And the parish, gentle as it tried to be, began to gossip. It started subtly, as these things always do, with concerned glances after Mass, with hushed conversations in the narthex over coffee and stale donuts. "Did you hear about the Miller boy? Such a sweet child, but..." The ellipses hung heavy in the air, filled with unspoken judgment, with diagnoses whispered behind cupped hands. "Poor Mark and Sarah, they've been through so much, and now this. A child like that, you wonder what he saw, what he went through." The narrative quickly shifted from potential miracle to confirmed mental illness, a comfortable explanation for an uncomfortable phenomenon. Leo, once the quiet, adopted boy, the object of a gentle pity mixed with hope, became the troubled one, the boy who tells strange stories, the one with a vivid imagination that's gone too far. Children, with their unvarnished honesty and unwitting cruelty, would sometimes repeat fragments of their parents' conversations, innocent cruelties that stung the Millers more deeply than any adult's direct judgment. I heard a small group of boys on the playground, mimicking Leo's earnest whispers, laughing about the talking statue. It broke my heart to witness the ripple effect of misunderstanding. The Millers, already fragile, felt the sting of this communal judgment keenly. They saw the way conversations paused when they approached, the way eyes would flicker from them to Leo, then quickly away, as if they carried a contagion of strangeness. The parish, which was meant to be a sanctuary, a haven of support, became a source of subtle pressure, reinforcing their deepest fears. They loved Leo, truly they did, but they were also profoundly human, susceptible to the judgments of their peers, desperate to present a facade of normalcy, even as their private world crumbled under the weight of an extraordinary secret. This external pressure fueled their internal panic, making them even more insistent that Leo's delusion be eradicated, whatever the cost, for the sake of his future and theirs. They were not malicious, they were simply afraid, navigating a situation for which no parenting book, no adoption agency, no amount of conventional wisdom had prepared them. I found myself caught in the middle, a priest who believed in miracles, yet also a shepherd tasked with caring for the mental and emotional well-being of his flock. My theological training encouraged an open mind to the supernatural, but my pastoral experience taught caution, particularly where children and vulnerability were concerned. I prayed, often and fervently, for guidance, for discernment. I watched Leo, hoping to see some sign that this was indeed a manifestation of trauma, something I could address with earthly means, with referrals to counselors or therapists, but all I saw was unwavering conviction, a quiet certainty that burned brightly in his small, fragile frame, a light that no amount of adult skepticism could dim. I tried to speak to Leo again, not to convince him otherwise, but to understand the depth of his experience, to find a crack in his certainty, a hint of childish play. "Leo," I asked one afternoon, sitting beside him in the church, the air cool and still around us, "when Our Lady speaks to you, what does it feel like? Is it like hearing my voice now, with your ears?" He shook his head slowly, patiently, as if explaining something obvious to a dull student. "No, Father, it's like a warm whisper in my heart, but it's her words. And sometimes, her lips move, just a little, and her eyes, they look at me and they're sad, but also full of love, like she knows everything about me and still loves me." His description was so vivid, so earnest, so specific, that it sent a shiver down my spine. It was not the vague, ethereal language of a child's imagination. It was the precise observation of a witness, detailed and consistent. Yet, even then, I found myself searching for alternative explanations, unwilling to fully embrace the implications. My faith, strong as it was a faith tempered by reason, by the weight of the material world. I had seen plenty of heartfelt devotion, but never a direct, ocular miracle of this nature. I offered Leo comfort, reassurance that Our Lady loved him, regardless of whether others understood his experiences. But I couldn't, in good conscience, tell the Millers that their son was truly conversing with a statue, not without more, not without something undeniable, something that would speak for itself. The spiritual chasm that had begun to form was now a gaping maw, separating Leo from his parents, from his community, and in a profound way, from the complete understanding of his priest. He was an island, surrounded by a sea of well-meaning but utterly lost adults, each trying to navigate the turbulent waters of belief and disbelief. His quiet, desperate faith, once a nascent root, was now a solitary tree, swaying in a tempest of misunderstanding, dangerously misunderstood, yet unyielding. He held onto his secret, not because he wished to hide it, but because he knew, with the clarity only children possess, that no one was truly listening, truly hearing the message he carried. And in that poignant silence, a different kind of desperation, a child's desperate yearning to be heard, to make the unseen seen, began to stir, gathering force, destined soon to manifest in an act that would shatter the silence of our parish, and ultimately rewrite the very definition of belief for us all. The stage was set, not for a quiet resolution, but for a climactic clash between the tangible and the miraculous, between human fear and divine intervention. The unyielding grip of Leo's secret, once a fragile sprout, had indeed become a solitary tree, swaying precariously in the tempest of misunderstanding that brewed within the Miller household, and by extension our parish. He held on to his conviction not out of defiance, but from a child's pure, unadulterated knowing. He understood with a clarity that eluded the adults around him that no one was truly listening, truly hearing the celestial message he carried. And in that poignant, suffocating silence, a different kind of desperation, a child's profound yearning to be heard, to make the unseen seen, began to stir, gathering an undeniable force within his small, beleaguered heart. It was destined, I now see, to manifest in an act that would shatter the fragile peace of our parish and ultimately rewrite the very definition of belief for us all. The stage truly was set, not for a quiet, gentle resolution, but for a climactic clash between the tangible and the miraculous, between human fear and divine intervention. The Millers, bless their anxious hearts, had reached their breaking point. I had watched, with a pastor's helplessness, as the gentle, hopeful light in Sarah's eyes dimmed, replaced by a weary, haunted flicker. Mark, usually a man of calm deliberation, grew increasingly withdrawn, his shoulders slumping under the invisible weight of whispered judgments and unanswered questions. Their dream of a normal, happy family, once vibrant and full of promise, was slowly being replaced by a nightmare of psychiatric evaluations, tense family therapy sessions that yielded only more silence from Leo, and the insidious spread of parish gossip. Every well-meaning question about Leo's imagination felt like an accusation. Every suggestion for a new specialist, a confirmation of their perceived failure. They loved Leo. I never doubted that. But their love was now laced with a potent cocktail of fear. Fear for his future. Fear for their reputation. And perhaps most acutely, fear of the unknown. Of a reality their ordered world could not comprehend. The tension in their home was a palpable, suffocating thing. A quiet hum that preceded a storm. It finally broke one Monday night, a few days after Leo had approached me with another of Our Lady's messages. A gentle plea this time for patience and understanding for those who struggled to see. I had once again gently steered him towards reflection rather than literal interpretation, a pastoral gesture I now regret with a profound ache in my soul. When he returned home, still buzzing with the conviction of what he'd heard, the Millers were waiting, their faces etched with a weary resolve. The argument began quietly, a low murmur from their living room that slowly escalated into clipped, sharp sentences. I heard about it later, piecemeal from Sarah, her voice still trembling with the memory. It had started with Mark's frustrated sigh, then Sarah's tearful plea. Leo, please, just tell us what the therapist said today. Just try to be normal, honey. For us. Leo, I imagine, stood before them, a small, unyielding sentinel of truth. He must have looked up at his adoptive mother, his eyes wide and earnest, and repeated the latest whisper from the alcove. She said to remember that even in the darkest night, the stars are still there, waiting to be seen. To Sarah, it was another fantasy, another sign of the problem that was slowly unraveling their lives. To Mark, it was a direct defiance, a deliberate refusal to engage with the reality they so desperately tried to create for him. The well of their patience, so carefully nurtured through years of waiting for a child, had run dry, leaving behind only the parched earth of anxiety and resentment. Leo, stop this! Mark's voice, usually modulated, cracked with frustration. There is no lady, there is no voice. It's your imagination and it's getting out of hand. But she's real, Leo must have insisted, his own small voice trembling now, but holding firm. She's sad. She wants us to know Jesus is here." Sarah sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "Oh God, Mark, what are we going to do?" Her words were not meant for Leo, but he heard them, felt their weight settle upon his small shoulders. This was a direct assault on the very core of his being, on the sacred, whispered truths that had been his only solace in a confusing, often lonely world. Then came the decree, delivered not in anger, but in the desolate finality of utter exhaustion. "That's it," Mark said, his voice flat and lifeless. "No more church. Not until you agree to talk to Dr. Evans honestly. Not until you stop with these stories." Sarah, looking up, her face tear-streaked, nodded numbly. "Just for a while, honey. Until you're better." Better. The word must have hung in the air. A cruel, invisible judgment. Better meant silencing the one voice that had offered him comfort. Better meant denying the reality that had brought him a sense of belonging in a world that had so often felt like a temporary, indifferent place. His one sanctuary, his silent confidant, the serene face of Our Lady of Grace, was now taken from him. It was an exile, a spiritual imprisonment, meted out by the very people who were meant to protect and understand him. Heartbroken and utterly unheard, Leo retreated into himself, the vibrant, earnest light in his eyes dimming to a smoldering ember of despair. He knew, with a child's stark certainty, that if he couldn't speak her words, if he couldn't access her solace, then he had to show them. If no one would listen to his whispers about Our Lady's sadness, he would make that sorrow visible, undeniable, even to those whose hearts were closed by fear and doubt. It was the desperate, flawed logic of a child, born of pure, unadulterated love and a profound sense of duty. He wasn't trying to destroy the statue, no, never that. In his mind, he was acting as Our Lady's hands, giving form to her celestial grief, her silent tears for a world that seemed to have forgotten her son, even when he was still so profoundly present. He waited until the house was dark, the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. His small heart thrummed like a caged bird, a mix of fear and an almost sacred resolve. He moved with a stealth born of necessity, slipping out of his room, his bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. His father's garage, usually a forbidden realm of tools and mystery, now beckoned with a singular, desperate purpose. He fumbled through the cluttered shelves, his small fingers brushing against forgotten toys, dusty gardening implements. His eyes, in the faint light filtering through the garage window, scanned for what he needed: color. He was looking for a shade that mirrored the deep, sorrowful blue of Our Lady's mantle, the color of the night sky, of profound melancholy, of the tears he imagined she shed. And there it was, nestled amongst cans of rust-proof primer and weed killer, a can of royal blue spray paint. Its label, depicting a bold, vibrant stripe of color, seemed to pulse with potential. It wasn't perfect, perhaps a shade too garish, too vibrant for the gentle sorrow he envisioned, but it was the closest he could find. It felt right somehow, connected to her. Clutching the cool metal can, its weight a strange comfort in his trembling hands, he slipped out of the garage and into the moonless night. The air was cool against his face, a silent witness to his solitary vigil. The short walk to the church, usually a comforting pilgrimage, now felt clandestine, fraught with an unfamiliar tension. The church itself, a familiar beacon of light and solace, loomed before him, a dark, silent sentinel. He knew, from countless hours spent exploring its quiet corners, that the old side door, the one leading to the sacristy, often had a stubborn latch. Sometimes, if one pushed just so, it would give. Tonight, in a small miracle of its own, it did. It creaked open, a groan swallowed by the vast silence of the night, inviting him into the sacred space. Inside, the darkness was absolute, save for the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp, a tiny red heart beating in the distant chancel. The air was cool, carrying the familiar scents of old wood, beeswax, and sacred incense, a comfort and a contradiction to his desperate mission. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor as he made his way through the shadowy nave, past the silent rows of pews, towards the familiar alcove. There she was, bathed in the faint, ethereal light filtering in from the street lamps outside. Our Lady of Grace, serene and unchanging. He approached her with the reverence of an acolyte, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't see a plaster statue. He saw her, the one who listened, the one who understood his secret, the one whose heart was sad. He uncapped the can, the harsh hiss of the spray paint an alien sound in the hallowed quiet. He held it in his small hands, a weapon and a brush, an instrument of both perceived desecration and profound devotion. He lifted it slowly, his gaze fixed on her face. He wouldn't mar her beauty. He would enhance her truth. He would paint her tears. With a child's earnest precision, he aimed the nozzle. One slow, deliberate streak of vibrant blue across her right cheek, tracing the path a tear might follow. Then another, mirroring it, on her left. The cold chemical paint splattered gently onto the delicate features, a stark, almost violent contrast to the soft, aged plaster. But in Leo's mind, it was not violence, it was a revelation. He was not defacing her, he was giving voice to her sorrow, making her invisible pain visible, undeniable. He imagined her sadness, the kind she had spoken to him about, the sadness for a world that had forgotten the presence of her son. And he, Leo, was helping her express it. He felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet triumph in this misguided act of pure faith. He had done it. He had shown them. It was in this moment, the blue paint still glistening wet on the statue's cheeks, the metallic tang of the spray still lingering in the air, that the sacristan, roused by a late-night noise, stumbled upon him. Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman whose devotion was matched only by her punctuality, had arrived earlier than usual to prepare for morning mass, worried by a strange sound she'd heard from her adjacent rectory apartment. She found him there, a small solitary figure illuminated by the beam of her flashlight, standing before the defaced statue. He was clutching the can of royal blue paint, his face streaked with tears that were very real, unlike the painted ones on Our Lady's face. His small frame trembled, not with guilt, but with the exhaustion of his desperate act, and the dawning realization of its profound misunderstanding. The shock on Mrs. Rodriguez's face quickly turned to a horrified gasp, then a distressed cry that echoed through the silent church. Soon, the flashing blue and red lights of the police cruiser pulsed through the stained glass windows, painting the sacred space with the harsh hues of human law and order. The quiet boy who heard heavenly whispers was now discovered, arrested, his small act of profound, misunderstood devotion misconstrued as an act of profound sacrilege. The contradiction was stark, the pain palpable. And as I later arrived at the scene called by the sergeant, looking at the crude blue lines on the serene face of Our Lady, I felt a deep, aching sorrow. A child's yearning to be heard had manifested in a way no one could have predicted, a way that seemed only to deepen the chasm of misunderstanding, cementing, for now, the tragic irony of his desperate faith. The stage was indeed set, not for a quiet resolution, but for a climactic clash, and the silence that followed Leo's arrest was not empty, but heavy with the unspoken prayers and unspoken desperation of us all. The pre-dawn chill of the rectory had given way to a fragile gray light when I finally made my way back to the church. The air inside still clung to the metallic tang of spray paint, an acrid counterpoint to the familiar sense of old wood, beeswax, and incense. What should have been a sanctuary of peace felt instead like a crime scene. A place where a profound silence had been violated, not just by a boy's misguided act, but by the crushing weight of human judgment and sorrow. The events of the previous night, the police, the sergeant's grim pronouncements, Leo's trembling figure, his small hands stained blue, had cast a long cold shadow over everything. I stood before the statue of Our Lady of Grace, the one Leo had loved so fiercely, the one he claimed spoke to him. She stood in her accustomed alcove, serene yet now tragically marred. A crude, royal blue streak, thick and garish, slashed across her delicate plaster cheek. Another trailed down the side of her nose, pooling slightly at the curve of her chin. It was a wound, undeniably, a shocking act of defacement that, in its stark reality, seemed to mock the very peace she embodied. My heart ached, a deep, weary ache that settled heavy in my chest. I had dismissed Leo's claims, offered gentle reassurances, but now, faced with this undeniable desecration, I felt a deep spiritual confusion. What had moved him? What despair had driven such a gentle soul to such an outward act of destruction? Soon the others began to arrive, drawn by the summons I had reluctantly issued earlier that morning. First, Mark and Sarah Miller appeared before me, their shoulders slumped as if under an unbearable weight, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have stolen their very color. Sarah's eyes, usually bright with a mother's watchful affection, were now hollow, rimmed with red, and Mark, typically so composed, kept running a hand through his already disheveled hair, a gesture of raw, uncontained agitation. They were hollowed out, certainly, but also imbued with a terrible, quiet shame. This was not the family they had dreamed of, not the son they had envisioned. The scandal of it all was a living thing, breathing in the quiet of the nave. "Father Michael," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a thread, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile morning. We don't know what to say. How could he, after everything?" Her gaze darted to the statue, then quickly away, unable to bear the sight. Mark finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "The police, they're going to release him to us this afternoon." "But, what then, Father? The whole parish knows. Everyone's talking. This is an embarrassment, a terrible blight." He didn't say it, but I could hear the unspoken question. "What about us?" What about our reputation? Our family? I placed a hand gently on each of their backs, offering what solace I could in the face of such overwhelming despair. We will face this together, I said, my voice quiet but firm. First we must understand. Then we must heal. But even as I spoke the words, they felt inadequate against the magnitude of the wound on the statue and on their hearts. A few minutes later, Mr. Henderson, a man whose stern demeanor was matched only by his unwavering dedication to parish finances and order, arrived with Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman whose practical efficiency made her an invaluable member of the parish council. They both stopped short at the entrance to the alcove, their expressions shifting from concern to outright shock at the sight of the defaced statue. "Oh, my dear lord," Mrs. Rodriguez gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Henderson's jaw tightened. He adjusted his spectacles as if a clearer view would somehow make the blue paint less real. "Father, this is quite frankly a disaster. The cost of restoration alone, not to mention the message this sends. We simply cannot have a desecrated statue of the Blessed Mother in our church. What will people think?" His focus was, as always, on the tangible, the institutional. We gathered in the alcove, a small, somber huddle. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with blame, with a collective sense of profound unease. I looked at the Millers, their faces contorted with a mixture of shame and bewildered pain. I looked at Mr. Henderson, whose furrowed brow spoke of spreadsheets and public relations. I looked at Mrs. Rodriguez, her usual warmth dimmed by a palpable sense of dismay. And then I looked back at Our Lady. The paint, in the harsh, impartial light of morning, looked even more offensive. It was not just an act of vandalism. It felt like a betrayal. And yet, Leo's earlier whispers echoed in my mind, faint and insistent. "She says her heart is sad for us. Tell them to remember my son is still here." Could this crude act truly be his desperate way of showing her sorrow, as the police report had relayed from his own tearful, confused confession? A child's flawed logic, yes, but a logic rooted in a desire to communicate, to be heard, to manifest an invisible truth. "We need to discuss the immediate steps," I began, my voice striving for calm amidst the swirling emotions. "First, restoration. We'll need to consult with experts, ascertain the best method for removing the paint without further damaging the plaster. This will likely be a considerable expense, but it is necessary." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "And the public perception, Father? This kind of incident can be very damaging to the parish, to faith itself. Perhaps a public statement, an apology from the boy, from the family, as soon as possible." Mark flinched, and Sarah let out a soft, choked sob. The idea of Leo, already so fragile and misunderstood, being paraded to issue a public apology for an act he believed was an expression of devotion, felt like another layer of torment. "We must be careful," I interjected, trying to soften the blow. "Leo is a child. A deeply troubled one, yes, but a child. His intentions, however misguided, sprang from a place of complex emotion. We must consider his spiritual well-being, and that of his family, above all else." "But what about the community, Father?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, her voice gentle but firm. "There are so many questions, so many concerns. People are already talking. Some are saying this is a sign. Of what, I don't know. But there's a great deal of anxiety." Anxiety. Yes. It was palpable, a low hum beneath our hushed discussion. The anxiety of scandal, of damaged reputation, of faith challenged, of the unknown. We were so caught up in the pragmatic, the human concerns, that we were losing sight of the deeper spiritual current that had brought us here. We saw a desecration. We saw an expense. We saw a problem to be solved. We had forgotten perhaps to see with eyes of faith. I looked at the statue again, at the crude blue lines, at the serene, painted eyes that seemed to gaze beyond us, beyond our anxieties, beyond our practical worries. It was a moment pregnant with tension, a culmination of misunderstanding, grief, and the profound silence of a child who had felt unheard by the world. And then, as if summoned by the very depth of our collective despair, a single golden shaft of morning sunlight pierced through the magnificent stained glass window, depicting the Assumption of Mary. It was an ancient window, lovingly restored, its colors vibrant with celestial light. This particular ray, narrow and focused, cut through the nave's lingering shadows, bypassing the pews, bypassing our huddled group, and landed directly, precisely on the face of Our Lady of Grace in her alcove. The alcove, previously dim and shadowed, was suddenly bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. Dust motes, previously invisible, danced like tiny stars in the golden column of light. The air seemed to still, the low hum of our anxieties fading into an unexpected quiet. Our voices, which had been discussing costs and apologies, died on our lips. No one spoke, no one dared. We simply stood, Caught in the sudden sacred silence, our gaze is drawn irresistibly to the illuminated statue. For on the statue's face, on the very crude royal blue streak that marred her plaster cheek, something impossible was beginning to happen. The light, as I described it, was no ordinary morning sunbeam. It felt in that moment like a divine finger pointing, isolating the sacrilege, yet also already hinting at a purpose beyond human understanding. We were frozen, a tableau of human anxiety and spiritual unease. Our gaze is fixed on the marring blue streak across Our Lady's placid cheek. The discussion about restoration costs, public apologies, and damaged reputations had evaporated, leaving only the sound of our own ragged breathing in the sudden cavernous silence of the nave. Then it began. The royal blue, that harsh chemical line of spray paint, seemed to lose its flat, opaque quality. It wasn't dripping, not yet. It shimmered, first subtly, like heat haze above asphalt on a summer day. Then with an increasing, almost liquid luminescence. My mind, trained in rational thought, immediately sought a scientific explanation. Condensation? A trick of the light? But the light itself was stable, unwavering. The shimmer grew, taking on an ethereal sheen, reflecting back the golden light of the Assumption window, not with the dullness of pigment, but with a vibrant inner glow. Before our astonished, disbelieving eyes, the line of paint began to liquefy. It didn't spread, didn't run like spilled ink. Instead, it drew itself inward, consolidating, gathering, a perfect glistening bead of what was undeniably blue, yet unlike any blue I had ever seen, a celestial blue, imbued with an impossible depth, as if it held the vastness of a moonlit ocean, formed at the statue's inner eye. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear Sarah Miller beside me emit a small, choked gasp, a sound halfway between terror and profound wonder. Mark, her husband, stood rigid, his jaw slack, eyes wide and unblinking. This single luminous bead of celestial blue then gathered itself, slowly, deliberately, into a teardrop. It was not a haphazard drip. It was perfect, perfectly formed, catching every photon of the morning sun and refracting it into a spectrum of soft, radiant colors. And then, with an unbearable slowness that stretched the moment into an eternity, it began its descent. It traced a path down the statue's plaster cheek, not a streak, not a smear, but a pristine, glistening trail. Each microscopic fraction of its movement was a revelation. It left behind no residue, no stain. The plaster beneath it, where the crude, human act of defacement had been, was utterly pure, utterly untouched, as if the blue paint had never existed there at all. It was as if the sorrow of Our Lady was not just wiping away a child's misguided action, but actively undoing it, purifying the very surface of the sacred image. Another bead began to form at the other corner of her eye, mirroring the first. Another perfect, impossible teardrop, heavy with an unspoken sorrow, radiant with an internal light. It followed the path of the first, a silent, celestial twin. The silence in the alcove was absolute, profound. Even the dust motes seemed to hang motionless in the light, as if creation itself held its breath. I felt a prickle on my skin, a tingling sensation that began at my scalp and spread down my arms, a recognition of something utterly beyond the veil, something profoundly sacred unfolding before us. The tears, once formed and descended, were undeniably real, yet undeniably miraculous. They weren't paint, not water, not pigment. They shone with an inner luminosity, holding within them what felt like all the sorrow and mercy of heaven, a liquid expression of divine compassion. They were silent witnesses, eloquent beyond any human utterance. They spoke of a mother's heart, wounded by human frailties, yet endlessly forgiving, endlessly loving. When the first teardrop reached the gentle curve of the statue's chin, it did not fall. It did not stain. It simply, impossibly, vanished. It dissolved into nothingness, leaving no trace, no wetness, just an astonishing absence. A moment later, its twin reached the chin, and likewise ceased to be. The statue of Our Lady of Grace, which minutes before had been marred by a desperate child's blue paint, now stood pristine, radiant, more beautiful, more serene, more alive than she had ever been before. Her face was flawless, untouched, the very air around her vibrating with a newly profound holiness. And then it came. A scent, subtle at first, then growing in intensity, filling the small alcove, then reaching out into the nave. It was the unmistakable, exquisite fragrance of roses, not fresh-cut roses, but roses warmed by the sun, their petals just unfurling, carrying a sweetness that spoke of purity, of paradise, of a heavenly presence. It enveloped us, a tangible embrace, a perfume of grace that sealed the impossible reality of what we had just witnessed. I looked at Leo, the little boy, who had stood accused, whose words had been dismissed as delusion, whose desperate act had been judged as sacrilege, now stood utterly still, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. His eyes, no longer haunted by fear or unheard pain, were fixed on the statue, shining with a quiet understanding, a vindication that needed no words. He had known. He had always known. The loop, the incomprehensible loop of faith and doubt, of accusation and truth, had closed in that sacred moment. Our Lady had confirmed Leo's message herself. She had wept. And we, the skeptical, the ashamed, the disbelieving, had been there to witness it. We had seen the impossible made real, the divine break through the mundane, leaving us shattered and reassembled in a new, wondrous shape. In the sacred silence of that alcove, there were no more doubts, only awe. The air, still faintly redolent with the impossible scent of roses, seemed to hum with a newfound truth. The harsh morning light, which had earlier revealed the cruel defacement, now bathed the pristine statue in a glow of divine affirmation. We stood, not as separate individuals burdened by our own anxieties and judgments, but as a single trembling congregation of witnesses, unified by a truth so profound it rearranged the very landscape of our souls. I watched Sarah Miller. The transformation on her face was breathtaking. The hollowed-out shame, the grief that had etched lines of exhaustion around her eyes, dissolved in a torrent of her own tears. She didn't just weep, she buckled. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she fell, not dramatically, but as if gravity itself had pulled her to the earth in humble recognition. Her arms reached out, not to the statue, but to Leo, her son, who had stood accused, dismissed, and now, finally, understood. She enveloped him in an embrace so fierce, so laden with repentance and love, it spoke volumes without a single word. I saw Leo, for the first time since I had known him, yield completely. His small frame, so often rigid with unspoken hurt, softened into his mother's arms. He buried his face in her shoulder. And though I heard no sound, I knew he wept too. Tears of release, of vindication, of a boy finally, truly seen and believed. It was a baptism of sorts, a washing away of years of misunderstanding, fear, and the agonizing chasm that had opened between them. Mark stood beside them, a towering figure now humbled. His hand, so often a gesture of discipline or frustrated concern, reached down and rested gently, almost reverently on Leo's head. His face, usually a mask of guarded practicality, was unburdened, a portrait of profound relief. There were no tears from Mark, not visible ones, but the tremor in his hand, the slight tremble of his chin, spoke of an internal flood. He had seen his son's supposed delusion confirmed by the Mother of God herself, and in that confirmation he found not only belief but liberation. The miracle had not merely cleansed a statue, it had cleansed a family, washing away the doubt that had poisoned their nascent love, restoring trust, and forging an unbreakable bond rooted in an extraordinary shared experience. The Millers were whole again, or rather, for the first time, truly whole. The quiet understanding that settled upon us in that sacred alcove did not remain confined within those walls. It spread, not like wildfire or a sensational headline demanding public spectacle, but like the gentle rising of the morning tide. A deep and quiet truth carried on the currents of human connection. The story of what happened that morning was whispered from heart to heart, shared not as a scandalous rumor but as a sacred confidence. Parishioners, whose initial reactions to Leo's claims had ranged from polite skepticism to outright dismissal, now approached me with eyes softened by reflection, sometimes even by tears. They spoke of a renewal, a rekindling of a faith that had perhaps grown stagnant, or a comfort in knowing that the divine was indeed still active, still present, still intimately involved in our lives. Our Lady of Grace Church did not become a tourist attraction, thank God. We were spared the busloads of curious onlookers, the souvenir hawkers, the circus that can sometimes accompany alleged miracles. Instead, it became something far more precious, a place of profound prayer. The alcove where the statue stood, once a quiet corner, became a focal point. People lingered there longer after Mass, kneeling in contemplation, whispering their intentions, their sorrows, their hopes. There was a palpable sense of reverence, a hushed expectation, not of another spectacle, but of a continued presence, a confirmation that prayers were heard, and that even the smallest, most vulnerable among us could be instruments of God's grace. I myself spent countless hours in that alcove in the weeks and months that followed, reflecting on the immeasurable mystery I had been privileged to witness. The encounter had irrevocably changed me, deepening my understanding of faith and revelation. I had always believed in miracles, of course, but often in an intellectual, theological way. This was different. This was raw, immediate, undeniable. It challenged my own cautious nature, my tendency to seek rational explanations, to gently guide away from what might be perceived as fanatical. Leo had taught me a profound lesson that morning, a lesson delivered not in theological texts, but in the shimmering silent tears of the Blessed Mother. I learned that day, with a clarity that still brings a lump to my throat, that God does not always speak in thunder. He does not always choose the powerful, the influential, or the wise to deliver his most vital messages. Sometimes his most earth-shattering miracles are delivered in the whispers of a child who felt unheard, unseen, and profoundly alone. And his most powerful messages, those that cut through the noise of a skeptical world and touch the deepest parts of our being, are sometimes written in the tears of his mother. She wept for us, for our doubts, for our fears, for our inability to see the simple truth of her son's continued presence. And in those celestial blue tears, she validated the purest heart among us and brought us all once more to our knees. We learned to listen anew, not just with our ears, but with our hearts, to the quiet, insistent voice of faith, a voice that speaks even when we cannot see, even when we do not believe, reminding us that he is always, eternally, here.